Okay, and I've started our recording. Amazing. So what you need for today is a Replit. And then we are in the penultimate week of class. I like that word. It means the second to last. So after we complete this week, we will be in the last week of class, which is very exciting. I'm so happy all of you have stayed with me throughout the summer. It's been a delight. You have been a delight. So this week we will learn about file handling. And then next week we'll have a quick session on importing libraries and packages in Python. And then I always like to have the very last class be chosen by the class on what topic you guys all want to learn about. So I'm about to launch a poll here. Actually, I've got to create the poll because Zoom crashed on me, but I'm going to launch a poll and then have you fill out like what you would like to learn about. So some of the options that I have as suggestions are a data science intro with pandas. So I am a data scientist. That means I analyze data using Python usually. So if you want kind of an intro with that, we can go into that using a library called pandas. We can look into making graphs using matplotlib or some other library but making graphs. Another topic could be, what do I do as a programmer? Sometimes we learn about programming and then we don't know how it can be applied. So I could show some of my actual code, talk about what I do for my job and how I got here. We could talk about how to set up Python or any other language on your own computer as opposed to using Replit, or we could talk about how to debug errors in your code and work through some of those common errors that we get. So I'm going to put this all into a poll and then release it for you. Maybe I'll do that for next class since we're past time. Let's see. Okay, so Zoom poll, next class. So go ahead and think about what topics you might be interested in, and then next class I will release that poll since I don't have it ready right now. Also, here, I believe you are all at the point now where you could do programming challenges. There are so many challenges online, entire organizations dedicated to posting interesting problems that you can solve via programming. And one of them that I really like is called Project Euler, EULER. These are some great math-based challenge problems. So really great if you are a math thinker or you really like math. I highly enjoy these. This is what I did when I was learning Python. And it gives you all of these problems that you can solve, and then even tells you how many people have solved them. So as you can see, as you go down, it gets less and less. But you click on it and it gives you the problem. Usually the first, it's pretty much in order of increasing difficulty. So the first one is the easiest. And so it says if we list all the natural numbers below 10, that are multiples of 3 or 5, we get 3, 5, 6, and 9. The sum of these is 23. Find the sum of all the multiples of 3 or 5 below 1,000. So some of the tricks with this are that if some of these you have to have creative ways to solve the problem, or else you may run out of memory, which we haven't hit before. So anyway, these are just great problems. I have the link there in the slides. And I see the question in the chat, will the poll be ranked choice? It could be. I haven't made the poll yet, so that's a good idea. We can do ranked choice if you'd like. That makes sense. I'm not sure how to facilitate that on Zoom, but I'm sure I'll figure out how to. They probably have an option for that. If not, then maybe I'll let you like choose one or two or something. Or if we can't figure a poll out, then you're free to email me with your choice. But yeah, Project Euler, really, really cool problems. And you just submit your answer to them, and they tell you if you got it right or not, and you get a little badge on your profile. So I've done several of them. I don't remember, more than 10, but probably less than 20. I don't know, it's been a while since I worked on them, but they are a lot of fun. So let us review functions. So last week we talked about functions. We talked about how we define functions and what functions are. So if you're still trying to remember, functions are bits of code that you save so that you can run them later. So here we're defining our function. We have def, that is the define keyword. And then you name your function. Always have these open and close parentheses here, no space in the middle. Open close parentheses, no space between the n and the parentheses here. and then a colon, because we're about to define our function. We have indented code here, so it's indented. That means it's within our function that we're defining. This tells Python what to do when it sees this command here. So when it sees my function, it's going to do whatever code is down here. And then when you've defined your function, you're able to use it later in your code. You can call it by saying my function. Don't forget the parentheses here. And then this will do whatever we told it to do up here. So we have defining the function and then calling the function. So we had this practice where we used defining function, calling function, and then also taking an argument into your function and returning. So we talked about a return value. So let me go to Replit and start up another Replit. Okay, and if you do want to follow along with these slides and including using any links that I have in there, all of the slides are available on the Google Drive. If someone wants to share that link, you are welcome to, but it's also on the class syllabus, which is always attached to these classes as well. So first, we're going to define our function. We're going to use the def keyword, and let's give a creative name to our function. So the purpose of the function is to take a list of numbers as an argument and then return a list of Booleans representing whether that number is even. So kind of like the is even function that we wrote last time. Define is even. And inside here, we want it to take some sort of variable as an argument. Specifically to us, it's going to be a list, but Python doesn't necessarily know that. In some languages, you do need to define or declare what type of variable the function will be accepting. That is not required in Python. So we're just going to tell it what the name of that variable is going to be within our function. So I'm going to call it num_list. Now, we can get to the fun part of defining our function. So it takes a list of numbers. The function should return a list of Booleans representing for each number whether that number is even. So these two lists should be the same length. If the input is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the output should be this list of Booleans representing, 1 is false, 2 is true, false, true, false, like that. So we want to see if the number is even, and we want to iterate through a list. So what is this saying to you? What do you think we need here? If we want to go through each number in a list, what are we thinking here? Go ahead and put in the chat. What should we do? We want to go through each number in a list. What do we need? Put your answer in the chat. Okay, so what do we need to do if we want to go through each number in the chat? I'm looking at the chat. What do we need to do if we want to go through each number in a list? What is the thing that I'm looking for? Hint, it's a loop, but what kind? All right, not a while loop. I did see someone put in there a for loop, or the start of a for loop, which is great. So if we want to iterate through each number in a list, that's a specific amount of times, because it's going to be the exact amount of times as in the list. Yes, yes, yes. Great, everyone, great. Yes, so we're doing a for loop. So we're going to say for num in num list. And we want to do something here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create our Boolean list, because we're going to output a Boolean list. And I'm going to say for num in num list, if our number mod 2 equals 0. Remember, this means if number is even. We've used this a lot. I told you we would. If number modulo 2 equals 0, this is how we mathematically say that something is even, an even number. Then we're going to add to our bool list. And what do I do if I want to add to a list? So on this line here, I want to add true to our Boolean list if the number is even. So what am I typing here? Go ahead and put it in the chat. What goes here? If our number is even, we want to add true to our list. You remember how to add to an empty list or any list? How do we add something to that list? Yes, great. So we have bool list dot append, and we're going to use parentheses. So don't use brackets, but you had the append correct. So we're going to use bool list dot append, open and close parentheses. Those are the curved brackets or parentheses. Bool list dot append, oops, true, capital T true. That is the Boolean in Python. Otherwise, else, bool list dot append false. So let's look at our code here. We have an empty list called bool list. I just started it, has nothing in it. Now we're going to say for num in num list. So we're going through each number that someone puts in the list up here. If that number is even, append true. So we're going to append to the end of this list true, or else the only other thing that could happen is that it's not even, and then we put false. So there we go. So we've got our list here. And now the last thing we need to do is we need to return that list. So we have our list. Let's say we've gone through. All right, my headphones told me I was disconnected. Can someone put in the chat that I'm still? Can you still hear me? I think you can. It says I am. Okay, thank you. All right, sorry for that. My headphones just said you are disconnected. Okay, so now we want to return our list. Oh, and I do want to address this question that I see in the chat. This is not a string. It is a Boolean value that's its own data type. So notice it's not in quotes. It's not a string. So just like up here, these are not in quotes. We want the actual Boolean values. So in Python, the word true with a capital T is a value. It represents true or 1 if you're into binary, and then false is 0 if you're into binary. But for us, it's just the words true and false. That is just what it represents to Python. So now let's return this. So what do we do here? What do I say to give the list back at the end of the function? So I'm going to get out of this for loop. And now the very last thing I want my function to do, return the list. How do I do that? Go ahead and type in the chat. So we're not copying the list. So when we want a function, we ended our, so we're done defining this function. Now we're done. And now we say return our list. Yes, exactly. So we're going to return bool list. So not num list, we want to return the list that we created. So when we get to a function, we want it to return a value. That means it's going to send a value back to whoever called it. We return this value here, which is our Boolean list that we've been creating. So now I wrote my function. I'm going to press run. It didn't run. What am I doing? What am I doing wrong? Why didn't this run? So how do I make it run? Yes, yes, perfect. Thank you. So we didn't call our function. So we have to say is even. This is us actually calling the function, and then we're going to put a list in here. So the example that I gave was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now if I print, so I'm going to say, well, here, I'll save it to a variable. So I'll say result equals is even, that's us calling our function, and then me putting in this list. Now, if I run this, oh, it's not going to print because I didn't say to print. Rookie mistake. All right, here we go. And now we have is even, and we printed that result here, and we get false, true, false, true, false, true, false, which is exactly what we wanted. One thing that we could do is we can come up with multiple lists to check this. So let's say I want to define a variable up here that I can easily change. So I'm going to say example list equals 3, 5, 7, 10, 1000. And so this should be false, 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 even, even. And now I can put this variable here. So you can give it a variable name. So I'm going to say example list here, and it knows that it's going to map this example list is now going to be this num list. So it knows that that's what you mean. All right, so now I have example list equals this. Result is even. We're calling that function, and we're going to print that result. False, 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 true, true. Perfect. Of course, this would break if we did something like added a string. Our function is not designed to handle that. So not all arguments converted during string formatting. So this is just saying, hey, there's a string in there. Oh no. So if we put in a string, it kind of breaks, but that is a-okay because we didn't care about that for this. Okay, so are there any questions? Do you have any questions over this exercise here or functions in general? How are we feeling about functions? All right, I'm not seeing any raised hands. Please do put questions in the chat, even if it's like a private message to me that says, I don't understand functions. That's totally fine. I do just want to make sure that everyone feels good. Okay, so this is a great question. Why would you put example list rather than putting num list? That is a great question. So I typically name my variable, this is not required, but I typically give my variables a different name than what this actual argument is. It's not a requirement. It's something that I do and that a lot of other programmers do. And I think it started because you don't want to confuse these two. So you have variables inside of here. And then if I created a variable called bool list outside of the function, it would be different than the bool list inside of the function. And that could be confusing if you're going through and reading your code. So I'm not going to get into how variables change inside and outside of functions, but it is generally best practice. Inside a function, you have certain variable names. Outside of that function, you want to use different variable names. So I'm going to say example list is 1, 5, 7, 10, 1000, and then I'm going to send that as example list. You could do num list, but it's preferred to create a different variable, give it a different name. Okay. And David, that's more of a question for later, maybe after class or something. I rarely use Lambda. Okay. Okay, and I didn't see if anyone raised their hand or not. If you please do raise your hand if you want to ask a question and I can unmute you. But some great questions in the chat. Yes, Sterling. And I will unmute you. Okay, Sterling, you should be able to unmute.
All right. Sure. I got a question. What's the answer about stopping bullying?
About having the Boolean?
Yep. Yes.
I am not sure what your question is. Can you repeat that? Oh, I have to unmute you again. Oh no, you're unmuted.
Oh. Really?
Yeah, could you repeat your question?
Okay. Sure. Don't worry about it.
No, you could still ask your question. I just didn't know what you were asking. Can you repeat it?
Sure. I want to learn about pool, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we did learn about bool just now. Yes. Yes. So we created our Boolean list. Okay. Now we are on to file handling. This is a Python way of saying you're going to be editing, opening, creating files, like text files, not Python files. So a way to manipulate files programmatically within Python. This is something that I did a lot in one of my previous jobs. And it's really good for reading in text data. So textual data could be, a text file, but we're not going to be talking about more complicated files like Microsoft Word or PDFs. Those take separate libraries. This is just Python's built-in file handling. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So file handling, this means just programmatically working with files. You're opening them, you're editing them, and you're creating files all from your Python file. So you're not using any sort of graphical interface to go in and edit a text file. You're editing it from your Python code. So you're doing it programmatically. This is really useful, like I said, for importing text data into your program, and it's only working for text files. There are other ways to open other files, but we won't talk about that in this class. Unless you want to learn about data science as the last class option. Anyway, so how Python deals with files is it creates what's called a file object. You can think of this kind of as another data type, although it's a bit more complex than just being an integer or a string. A file object is its own thing. So this is an object that allows Python to interface with the files. It's basically creating a variable that represents the file and the state of the file. So what characters are inside the file? Is the file already open? Does it exist? Stuff like that. So this is going to be a variable that holds the file information. And usually it's named fo or fo. This stands for file object. That's not required, but most people programming in Python that you might find online will name the file object fo. So how we're going to interact with these file objects is using the open function. So this will open a file as a file object. Now, remember us talking about paths and opening files and knowing the relative path from your Python program. So you need to make sure that that file that you're opening, you know the path to it. So we're going to write our file paths as strings, and we're going to put that inside this open function. So this is a function predefined in Python. We put in our path and then what's called a read-or-write permission. This file path is going to be a string. So if you have a folder called documents, and then inside that folder you have myfile.txt, that is the path to your file. It does need to be relative to your Python environment, which we will look at. This just means Python needs to know how to find your file. And then what you also put inside of this open function is the read or write permissions, which we're going to talk about. These are just going to be a single character string. So here's an example of how we would create a file object. So we name it FO, that's just convention, equals open, and we have in quotes myfile.txt. So that's saying find this file. It's in the current directory because we didn't put any sort of slashes to indicate you need to go into another folder, and X. And we're going to talk about what exactly this means, what this X means, how we can create a file, how we can overwrite an existing file. For now, we're just showing how to use this open function. So here's another view of how we use this open function. So you name your variable. It's usually FO, but it doesn't have to be. You can name it my_file. We call the open function. We say open. We have those parentheses. We give the file path as a string. So it's in quotes. myfile.txt is the path for this one. And then a permission as a single character string. So this is an example of using that open function. And this is going to be how we access files in Python for this class. Just going to let you look at that for a little bit. Our open function. Okay, so let's talk about file permissions. That is this thing over here, this W in quotes. That is an example of a file permission. So what does that mean? Well, file permissions are ways to put restrictions on what you can and cannot do with a file. So this is an example. You could be able to read the file, you can open it and read it, but you can't edit it. That's like if someone sent you a Google Doc or something, but you don't have edit permission, they have to add your email. It's something like that. So you're able to read the file, but not edit it, which is also called writing. Maybe you're able to add text to the file, but you're not able to replace text that was already there. So you can open it, you can see the text that's already there, but you can't replace it. You can just add to the end of the file. Maybe you can read and write the file. You have full control. You can open a file, you can write the file, and this is including overwriting the entire file. Maybe there was contents there already. You opened a file that existed, and then you erased all the contents and put in your new content, and then that's the file now. So these are very important. They're set by the programmer, and they're very important because they ensure that your program doesn't accidentally change a file or overwrite previous work. So if you don't need to edit a file, don't give editing permissions in your program. If you only need to read it, just give reading permissions. If you just want, if you don't care and you're supposed to overwrite a file and completely replace it with new data, then you can do that read and write permission. And we'll talk about what all of those are. But you as the programmer will set this when you open the file. When you open it, you set that permission for your program. And we represent these by single letters. So there's R, W, A, and X are the main ones. So let's talk about read only. So this allows, as it sounds, it allows for reading the contents of the file. So if you open it with R, this will allow reading the contents of the file, and it will give an error if that file doesn't exist, because you can't read a file if you can't find the file. You can't read a file that doesn't exist. And this is represented by R. So like we talked about, sorry, I'm going back very quickly. This right here is where we're putting that file permission. So right here, if this was an R, that would mean you can open myfile.txt and you can read it. All right, back to read. So that's the read permission. The write permission allows for editing a file. Writing means editing. So this allows for editing a file, and it automatically includes reading. So if you have write permission, you also have reading permission. So it allows you to read and edit a file. And if the file doesn't exist, it will create a new file. So if you give it a path and that file does not exist, if you have this W as your permission, that means you're allowed to create a new file. So if you put in like myfile.txt and there's no file named that already, it will create a file for you. So pretty handy. If you're creating a new file, it will automatically do that for you. Next permission is called the create permission. This allows for reading and editing a file. And this one is a bit different. It gives you an error if the file does exist. This is because you're saying you're opening it with this X permission, which means you're not expecting the file to already exist. You're expecting to create a new file. But if you give it the same file name as something that exists, you're going to overwrite it. So this is a way to protect yourself from overwriting or erasing a file that already exists by opening in create permission or X, where you can read and write a file just like normal. But if the file name that you gave it already exists, then it will give you an error and say, hey, you can't do that because this file already exists and you're not allowed to overwrite that file. So this prevents you from overwriting. Whenever I hear the word overwriting, I think of the first time I ever heard that phrase, which was when I was playing Pokemon on my Game Boy, and you could only have one save file. And if you went to go save your game, it would say there is already a save file. Saving now will overwrite that save file. And that is like the first time I heard the word overwriting. So that's what I think of every time. So maybe if you don't know that word or you're not familiar, that's what I think of. I think of save files in video games, specifically the Game Boy. Anyway, back to programming. We have the final permission that we'll talk about in this class, which is append, the append permission. In this, you are adding text to the end of the file. So just like with our append on lists, the word append means to add to the end. It's got end, append. So anyway, this is represented by A in quotes, and this will allow you to open a file, read it, and then add text to the end of it. So you're not able to add text to the beginning, to the middle. You can't erase or overwrite anything that's currently there, but you can add to the end of the file. One thing about the append is if the file does not already exist, it will create it. So it's not going to give you an error. It's just going to create the file if it doesn't exist. And then you can append from an empty file, which is kind of like just creating a new file. Okay, so that's all about file permissions. So I will pause here and see if you have, I'm going to go back to this little graphic. Pause here. Are there any questions about opening a file, about this permission stuff here? So we've got read, which is R, W for write, X for create, and A for append. And this is another one of those things about programming that I'm not expecting you to remember the small details of each of these, the nuances of each of these permissions. So if you have to say, I know I need to go open a file and I need to edit it, do I need append or write, and you Google it, that's totally fine. I had to Google to make sure I remembered what all of the different letters were that you could put into this. So this is not something that you need to 100% commit to memory. Just know that these are the different options. The main one you'll be using is probably X, because X will give you an error if the file does exist. It's pretty nice so that you don't overwrite an existing file. Okay, so after we open a file, we always, when we're done, close the file. Otherwise, your file is just open and it creates difficulties when multiple people need to edit the same file or when you need to go back and your file was just kind of left open. So we close the file. So fo.close closes the file. So this is going to be replaced with whatever you named your file object. So in all of these examples, I named it fo. So fo.close, close the file. This prevents, loss of data, same file being opened multiple times. It's just good practice. So we're going to open. So step one, open the file, put in your path and your permissions. Do whatever you need to the file. In this one, we're only allowed to read it. We set just the read permission. And then you're going to say fo.close. And now you're done with that file. Okay, and then I saw a question in chat just now, how does X help with overwriting the file? So it helps you not overwrite the file because X, when you specify X, if that file already exists, so if we give our file name, I say myfile.txt, and there's already a file on my computer in that directory that is called myfile.txt, then it will give me an error and it won't edit the file because it won't overwrite the file. So X is helpful if you just want to create a file if it doesn't already exist. So you're not erasing anything. Okay, so we open the file, do what we need with the file, and then close the file. And that's just as simple as fo.close. Okay, so now let us talk about reading the file. So if we just specify R, we're able to read the file. Also with W, you're able to read, and X, you're able to read. But let's just talk about reading the file. So once you've created a file object, you can use several different methods to read its contents. So we open our file, but that doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of telling Python, here's this file, here's where the file's located, here's the permissions for the file. There you go. Python says, thank you. Okay. And then it waits for you to tell it what to do with that file. So you've created your file object. Now we need to tell it what to do. So let's talk about reading, different ways to read the contents of a file. So if the file doesn't exist, usually there's an error. I have a little bubble here that is not correct. I'm going to get rid of that before I forget. It will create the file if the permission is W. There used to be, unless I am insane, when I learned Python, there used to be an option called R+, and that was read and write. And I don't think that is supported anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of that. Apologies for that oversight. All right, let's go back to this. Okay, so we're reading a file, and we want to have different methods. So first of all, if the file doesn't exist, you get an error, unless your permission is W, in which it will create a new file. But if our file does exist, we can use fo.read. That will read the entire contents of the file and print it out for you as a string or save it as a string. So this will read the entire file, or you can put a number inside of these parentheses here that specifies the number of bytes you want to read. But this is not really recommended for large files because it's going to read the entire file. So if you have like a whole book saved as a .txt file, you're going to run out of memory real fast by calling fo.read. What is preferred is fo.readLine. This will read a single line, just like the name implies, read line. It reads a single line from the file. So just like Python, text files are separated by lines. So like whenever you press the enter key, you're creating a new line. And this will return to you one line from the file. And so you can imagine using a loop to go through different lines of the file, maybe stopping once you get to a certain line number, or when you find something within the file. So you can use a loop to read one line at a time. Usually you're going to do that with read line. Or if you just want to read the first line, fo.readLine. fo.readLines reads all lines in the file or a specified number of lines. So usually if you're going to use read lines, you're saying fo.readLines, and then you're putting 2 in here. And if it does what I think it does, if I remember correctly, if you put a number in here, that's the number of lines it will return. It's either the number of lines or the number of bytes. I feel like it changes every time I read it, but this should be fo.readLines, and then you put a number in here, and that represents the number of lines that you're going to retrieve. So if you want 2 lines, if you want the first 10 lines, you can use read lines. So let's look at an example here, reading a text file. So to show you, I'm going to show you a couple things. I'm going to show you how to create a text file using Replit, and I'm going to show you what we can do with that text file. So let's delete this here. So go to shell. You can go to shell, or you can go over here. This is probably easier. So we can create a new file in Replit. This is just preparing for our program. Let me get rid of this. So this is not part of our file handling. This is just me preparing to write a program. So let's say I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it myfile.txt. I put that .txt extension. It knows that it's a text file. I'm going to say, hello. This is Miranda. This is my file. End of the file. So this is just me writing a file. It's just like opening Notepad on your computer. I'm going to save it. And now I've got Over here, you can see your document structure. We have main.py where we write our Python code, and then we have myfile.txt. So this is now in what we call our environment. It's in our directory. So these are in the same folder. And if you want to go over here and you remember our handy dandy command line commands, we can type ls to get a list of current files in our directory. So we can see main.py, that's our Python file. We have a couple automatically generated from Replit, don't worry about those. And then we have myfile.txt, which is our text file. So we're able to easily access this from our Python file. All right, now let's actually do the programming. So I'm gonna practice using functions. All right, I'm gonna start with a main function. I'm gonna say def main. I'm gonna press enter a couple times, and then the very last line, I'm gonna remember to call main. So that's a good practice. Define main, and then go ahead and put main, call main at the very bottom so that your code runs when you press enter or control enter. Okay, so now, what do we want it to do? We want to read a text file. So I'm gonna say fo equals open. Now path to my file. For us, because we're in the same directory as our file, which we did by design, I'm gonna say myfile.txt. That's what I named my text file, myfile.txt, and I only want the permission to read. I don't want a permission to write. I only want my program to be able to read. So here we go. We've opened the file. Now I'm going to go ahead and put fo.close here so that we don't forget to close our file. So we have open, we have close. In the middle here, we can do whatever we want. So let's say I just want to read the first line, fo.readline. And then I'm going to close it. So right now we just have a function that opens our file, reads the first line, and then closes the file. So let's see what happens when we run. Go back to console to see the output from your Python program. I'm going to run. And it didn't do anything. That's because this read line is just reading it. It's not going to print it or anything. So if you would like to print the contents or save the contents, actually it's best practice to save it. So let's say first line equals fo.readline. And then let's say we just want to print that first line. So print first line. Now let's run this. And it's going to print that line for us. So this was the first line. And if we go back to myfile.txt, we can see line 1 says hello. So first line, fo.readline. Okay, so now read line is a little special in that when you read a line, it has an imaginary cursor or a programming cursor. So your cursor, just like a mouse cursor, starts at the beginning of a file. So I'm going to show you visually if you can see my cursor here. The Python cursor is going to start at the beginning of a file, and you say read line, it's going to go zoop, and then it's going to end here at the end of the line. So now the next time you call read line, the cursor starts here. And then you say read line, it's going to go to the next line and then read this line. There's nothing here, so it's just going to stay there, but that's going to be the end of the line. The third time you call read line, it's going to jump down here and then read this line, and then the cursor is going to end at the end of the line, and so on. So each time you call read line in a sequence, it's going to go through the next line. So if we want to read multiple lines and save each line to a different variable, back here, say first line equals fo.readline. I'm going to say next line equals fo.readline. And now we're going to say third line equals fo.readline. Probably should have named that one second, but that's okay. So we're reading each line here. We're saving it to a variable, and then we can print the lines. So if you remember, the second line of our code actually doesn't contain any text, so it should just be blank. And if we print all of these, it will print the lines that we saved. So hello, a blank line, and then this is Miranda. So pretty nifty. Okay. So that is how we read lines. So are there questions? about reading a file. I'm going to show you a couple more examples, so don't worry. Okay, so another example. So we looked at read line, which is going to go through each line as many times as you call it. Let's look at, I'm going to call this file contents equals fo.read. So if you remember, .read gives you the entire file contents. I said it's not really recommended just because if you have a really large file, it can take up a lot of memory. But in this case, we only have, 7 lines, so it shouldn't be too bad. So if we wanted to take this file and then read the entire contents into one variable, then we can. And so we closed our file, and now I can print file contents, and then that will print the entirety of the file contents here. So hello, this is Miranda, this is my file, into the file. So that is on reading files. Okay, so now, if there's not questions. Okay, yeah, so how do you read a line that isn't the first without doing it multiple times? So that is a great question. Thank you for asking. So if I go back to these slides. So read line reads a single line, read lines reads all lines in the file or a specified number. So if I do read lines, and then let's say I want to read 3 lines, and I know this is not quite your question yet. I can specify, that didn't actually do what I wanted. Okay, so I need to read up. So off of the top of my head, there are a couple different ways to do that. One is to go in a list if you know the line number that you need, and skip to that line number from a list. Let's see though, I'm going to see real time figuring out Python, read a specific line from a file. I don't think I've ever had to do that. And Geeks for Geeks is a great website. Except sometimes you have to pay for it. Just don't. So there's not a way to actually specify that with read lines. So what they do here, and if you want to read this, I'll put it in the chat. Oops, let me make sure I'm sending that to everyone. Okay, so this is the article that I just pulled up real quick. Great way to debug Python here. So if you want, you can say file contents equals fo.readlines. And now, let's see, print file contents. It's going to print that in a list. And if you want, let's say the 3rd line, you could print, because we're starting at 0, so 0, 1, 2, the 2nd index of that file, and just, there we go. Okay, it just took a while. And then just print just that line. So that is a great question. I've never had to do that. I always love when I get questions that I've never had to actually think about before. So one method. So it's not really like a native method. It's kind of you read all of the lines and then choose which line you want. Great question. Thank you. Okay, with our remaining time. So we talked about writing a file. We talked about reading a file. Next is writing a file. I don't think I want to get too far into that just yet. So we'll start and then kind of see where we get to by the end of the class. And then I'll stop and let you ask questions, or we can run through an example. So you are able to write a file as well. We talked about using that W permission that allows you to insert text. If the file doesn't exist, it's going to create the file. But that means it's going to overwrite any other file that did have that name. So if you, the way that you can write to the file is using fo.write, and then you're just going to put the string that you want to write. It's always a string because it's text, right? So we're always going to write a string to a file. So it's really important to remember that this is just a literal string. You can't press enter and have it know that means a new line. So if you want to use the enter key or make a new line, you have to use the \n character, that's the new line character, and appropriate amount of spacing where you need that. So let's look at a quick example here. So we have read, we practiced read. Now, if I want to get this file, I'm going to say write. So now I'm able to read it and I'm able to write it. So I'm going to, let's say file contents equals fo.read. So read lines returns in a list. Let's just get the whole contents. Now, fo.write. This is the new file contents. Then I'm going to say \n for new line. The file has been overwritten. So we open our file, we read all the lines. You don't have to read it. I'm just going to show you what I'm going to call this, original content. And then let's read that again. New content equals fo.read. And then we can close it. So what I did here, I opened the file, I read in the original contents, and now I'm going to overwrite it by saying fo.write. This is just going to start writing into the file no matter what's there. And then new contents, I'm saving that. So let's see what happens. Ooh, not readable. Oh, so I suppose. Oh, file exists. Oh. Someone said you need to open with R+. Okay, so I thought R+ was incorrect. No, it's not. Okay, then I was thinking of something else. So thank you for that. I thought for some reason I thought that R+ was the incorrect way to do it now. But so if you want to be able to read and write, you need R+. I'll go ahead. I'll redo the slides after this class. Read and write is R+. W only lets you write. You cannot read it, which to me doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to be able to open a file and put text in, but not be able to read the text that you just put in there. That doesn't make sense to my brain. Okay, so we're opening it with R+. Sorry about that. Okay, and I'm going to show you what this was. So, we've overwritten the file. And now I'm wondering, why did it put that in there twice? I think I must have accidentally ran this twice. No. Python mysteries. Okay, it's putting it there twice, which I'll probably realize why it's doing that exactly as you all log off. But anyway, what I wanted to show you was opening the file. R+ allows you to read and write. You can read in the contents, you can write new contents, and then see how that changed it. So if we wanted to print, it's like I saved the old contents, right? So I can print original contents, and I can print new contents. So I'm actually going to go back and change this here. I'm just going to make it say hello. Because I already ran it, I already changed the file. I run this. Original contents. Oops. And remember, I should have asked you guys what was the problem. So I had this here, and it wasn't indented inside of main. So it said this variable is not defined. Always remember your indentations. Okay, and so we printed the original contents, and then it didn't print the new contents. There we go. Oh, it's appending. I guess R+ appends. Okay. So we can keep running that. Oh, so this is appending. So this is the same as A. No, apparently it's not. Okay. obviously Miranda needs to read up on file handling. But if we just didn't care about reading and we just wanted to write, we can get rid of all of that. And you can see that if we open a file and we write to it, now it's overwritten all of the previous content that we had. So we're able to read it, we're able to write it, always remember to close. Okay, so I see we are out of time now. So do stick around if you have questions for me about reading or writing a file. And I will see you on Thursday. I will be preparing a poll for what we want to learn about on the very last day of class. Thank you so much, everyone. Please do stick around if you have questions. Otherwise, I will see you on Thursday. Bye. Yes, Felix.